Hey everyone, and welcome back. This video is going to be drastically different from the rest of my usual videos, so if you don't want to hear me ramble on about the last couple years of my life, then feel free to skip this one. With that out of the way, basically what I'm going to do here is run down the few events in my life that led me up to running this channel. This video will be followed up with a second part as to why I'm so slow. Some of that will be discussed in this video, and some of that will be discussed in the next video. My interest in mechanical things has always been very apparent. I spent my childhood years tearing things apart and taking parts from them, and motors, and wiring up batteries to them, and making little cars and different little toys. And at a certain point, my parents got me the Lego Mindstorms robotics set there for Christmas, the little programmable Lego brick and everything, and I did a lot of that. As I got older, I got into motorcycles and snow machines, and I fixed those and played around with those all through high school. And at the end of high school, I had a co-op placement at an engine machine shop. There I shadowed the head machinist, and not the head machinist, the machinist that works on cylinder heads. He showed me the ropes of rebuilding heads and doing all the testing, planing, the whole 9 yards, as well as showing me some other stuff throughout the shop. From there, I took a machinist course at my local college, which then was enough to get me in the door at a machine shop in town. After a short while of working at this machine shop, they hired me on as apprentice, and after about 2 years, I ended up going through the apprenticeship course at a college a few towns over. Now, I finished all the schooling before I had the hours to write my Red Seal, which is the Canadian trade classification, and in between the time of finishing school and acquiring the hours to write, I ended up having a kid, and life became too busy, and I never did end up writing for my trade ticket. All the while, I continued to work at the same shop, where they eventually made me machine shop foreman, or lead machinist, which wasn't really a big deal considering I had like one guy underneath me. During this time, I did the best I could for the shop to, give them a good reputation and pump out quality work. And for anyone interested, this was a manual machine shop that did all sorts of other stuff, so I got my hands into welding and a lot of millwright work as well. Normally the shop focused on hydraulic stuff, but we did all sorts of walk-ins and jobs for the local plants and facilities in the area. This business liked to shift with the changing needs of the community, so it was quite interesting some of the stuff I got my hands on to work on. For an example of the range of things I worked on, we worked on rock crushers very often, rebuilt the entirety of the machine, all the way down to fine, unique, expensive, one-off engine parts for some customized, very rare car from the 60s once, and anything in between that we could manage to fit or do on our ancient equipment. Interestingly enough, somewhere around the 10-11 year mark of me working there, the shop I worked for picked up the equipment and some of the employees from the engine shop that I had a co-op placement back in high school in, which for a time ended up working out very well because I was familiar with the guys, familiar with most of the equipment, and kind of mingled in between them, helped them doing jobs, and they helped me do some jobs. The other good part about this is I got to learn a lot of the equipment that I didn't get my hands on while I was in high school, which allowed me to really stretch my legs on one of my favorite things, internal combustion engines. So now that I got my field experience kind of laid out for you, this is where things kind of go sideways. Of course, this happened in 2020 when everybody was just starting to panic. We were considered a essential service, so I was still at work. Now, for the last year or so, I hadn't really been feeling that great, but I just thought I was just tired and being a pussy, so I said, well, suck it up, and continued to go to work and do what I had to do. But I remember the last day I went to work. I went to work, did my normal job. It was a very hectic day. It was a Friday, and it was midsummer, so it was 30 plus degrees, and the building we were in basically is dark green. It cooks like a barbecue when the sun's on it. That night I go home and I picked up a cough, and of course at the time I was a little bit worried about what the cough was for. That cough ended up keeping me up all weekend for the most part, and I didn't get more than about 6 hours of sleep. I was supposed to leave for an out-of-town job as of Monday, and ended up calling in sick and trying to sleep most of the day. Again, didn't get much sleep. The next day I called in sick again, and the same thing. That night I was finding it very hard to breathe and ended up going to the hospital. Now, when I was going to the hospital, I was worried that I had the thing everybody'd been panicking about for the last couple months. At any rate, I walk into the emergency room, they sit me down, and of course when you walk into the emergency room at 2 a.m. saying you can't breathe, in my town, you don't get treated really that well. They kind of assume you're on drugs and just, sit you down and do the basic minimum. And that bare minimum including checking blood pressure. So the blood pressure machine squeezes my arm and the lady's asking me the questions. I don't get finished the questions as the machine finishes and beeps, and she looks over and she immediately calls somebody and starts looking panicked and saying things. I forget really what happened from that point, but I did catch a glimpse of the machine before they wheeled me out. And it said 244 over 187 with a heart rate of 120. At the time, in the heat of the moment, I didn't really know what was going on, and it didn't really register. I felt terrible and was more concerned with the fact that I couldn't breathe. They moved me into an isolated room and immediately started doing blood work and gave me some pills that should drop my blood pressure. They ended up coming to the conclusion that I didn't have the plague and it was some sort of lung infection. However, this lung infection was caused by the fact that I was drowning in my own fluids because my kidneys had shut down. Turns out my kidney function was less than 6% and I was literally dying. So for the immediate course of action, it's a huge dose of IV antibiotics, which worked within about an hour, and then they moved me into an isolation room and did another nose swab. Hooked me up to some oxygen and hooked me up to all sorts of other tubes and hoses and IVs and stuff. It was pretty crazy. But because I could breathe finally, I managed to fall asleep. I may have passed out, I'm not really sure. From this point forward, the next 3 weeks is kind of a fuzzy mess, but I'll try and piece it together for you the best I can. But for sure, the chronology of these first few events is definitely not in the right order, and I really don't know what the actual order is. The first thing I remember is waking up and basically being blind. It was kind of like coming in from a sunny, snowy day in the middle of winter into a very dark room and everything's purple and pink and blue for a few minutes. Or, when you stare at a light for too long and you get that purple kind of ball floating around in your vision. Well, my whole vision was like that. Of course, I panicked. They did an eye test and a couple other tests and then went away. The next thing I know, I'm being wheeled off to the MRI machine or a CAT scan. I couldn't tell you which is which from being inside them. All I know is both of them make me panic now, which is fun. And the next thing in order, I think, is the doctor asking me some questions, which turned out to be the nephrologist or the kidney doctor and the neurologist. They proceeded to poke me in the feet, do a bunch of stuff, ask me some questions, make me do a couple tests, which most of them I failed. I couldn't move my feet or legs by this point and couldn't really feel from my belly button down. I was also severely weakened in my arms. Somewhere during this meeting, both of the doctors explained to me that I had a stroke, or a couple of small strokes combined. I'm not exactly sure. By this point, I could see mostly, but everything was still kind of pinkish and bluish. It's rather hard to describe. You'd have to see it to understand. Also, at this time, my perception was just out to lunch. The room I was in, it felt like I was in a different room every time I woke up, but knowing full well that I was in the same room for a whole week. At any rate, the next thing I remember is going under for the catheter installation for dialysis. I remember waking up from that and being very hungry. The lady handed me some food, and I ate it immediately, and I remember the nurses being surprised that I was hungry after all I'd been through, which I thought was weird because I'm basically always hungry. Especially in that condition, I actually don't know how long I hadn't eaten for, because I don't know when exactly this was in relation to when I was dropped off at the hospital in the first place. Shortly after this list of events, they handed me my phone and my possessions that I brought with me, which from this point forward things get a little bit more concrete, but never really solid until even months out of the hospital. With my phone, I kind of had a peace of mind. I could call the family and let everybody else know, and they had told me it had been about a week since anybody had talked to me or heard anything, and because I was an adult and didn't really give them any information on next of kin, they didn't tell anybody. So my parents, girlfriend, and child were just waiting to see what had happened, hearing nothing from me for about a week. Overall, they were happy to hear I was alive and, of course, worried about my situation. I have learned more recently that I'm kind of glad nobody was around for that first week and I was kind of in isolation. As depressing as the whole situation was, glad nobody had to see me like that. I was not in a pretty situation. Shortly after all of this, things started to look up. They moved me into a room. I was with other people. I was a lot happier just being around other people. And then I started rehabilitation, at least the little tiny bit that was available during the plague, which at least allowed me some freedom and gave me a walker, which allowed me to, get to the bathroom on my own, which is a very nice thing in this situation. This is around the time I actually started on dialysis. They might have done dialysis while I was passed out at previous points. I don't know. Also, during this time, I was in extreme pain and was drugged on and off throughout the whole experience. Within about 2 weeks total, maybe 2.5, I had managed to hit the minimum for them to let me go home, which was climb down and back up a set of stairs at the hospital, which I had managed to get most of my at least right arm strength back at this time. So I more or less just pulled myself up the railing because at that point I just wanted to go home. I didn't really have a proper frame of understanding of basically anything at that point. And I had still missed the point that I'd had a stroke, so I didn't understand why I had to relearn to walk. But strangely enough, at the time, I didn't even really question it. It was like, oh well, this is what I'm doing now, I guess. So the next day, I got the go-ahead to go home, but I was going to be released after my dialysis. So during dialysis, they need to thin the blood, otherwise it has a tendency of clogging up in the machine, which causes, my whole body's blood to be thin slightly. They were also giving me blood thinners, injecting me in the morning, and they were supposed to be not doing it on the days of dialysis. I found this out later. The reason for this was because I had a kidney biopsy, and too many blood thinners could cause this to rupture, and kidneys are basically connected directly to your aorta and get a huge amount of flow of blood, and if you bleed there, it's a problem. That being said, I had a bleed there, and it was a problem, a big problem. I'm not really going to go into too many details, but I remember a little bit of it and massive amounts of pain. The next thing I know, I'm having a spiritual event. I remember being in like an orangey red room that wasn't really a room, and I didn't really have a body, and I was talking to a woman in a robe that at this point I think she told me a lot more than I remember, and then kind of sloughed it off and finished it up with, you can come or you can go back, but if you go back it's going to be a lot of pain. And without question, the next thing I remember is waking up and again not being able to see. At this point it was more of a, oh shit, I'm blind again, not, oh crap, I'm blind, panic. The next thing I notice is the immense pain in my belly. Like my whole torso is just bruised and just so much pain. So far in my life, this is like the second most painful thing. The first one was actually bleeding out. The pressure and the cramp feeling was just off the charts. I've never felt anything like that. Which leads to the next fun bit. When the nurse rolls the dialysis machine in to finish my dialysis from the previous night, I panicked. Like, the first time I've ever uncontrollably panicked like that since I was a little kid. It was really surreal to kind of think back at that now and just be like, wow, how much control like my fear had over me at that point. This, I will later learn, is PTSD, which is not fun. At any rate, I got over the initial issues and continued to recover until they finally let me go home. I struggled around the home, not being able to do a lot of the projects and fun things that I did before, now that I had the time to do them, because I wasn't very mobile and not very capable of doing things. Plus, I had the dialysis catheter still, which meant I had to stay in a very clean environment for the most part. I couldn't even shower. I had to have like a sponge bath. It was brutal. So at this point, I had already had a 3D printer, which was a Monoprice Mini V2, I think. I forget how it's named out, but it's, you know, everybody knows the little Monoprice guy, which I had probably 3 years at this point. So I got the wife to get my computer, my desk, and everything down from my normal office and bring it down to my new bedroom, which used to be my living room, because I can't go up and down stairs reliably. At any rate, having access to my computer, Fusion 360, and my printer allowed me to at least do something to, you know, stop that little tick in my brain that tells me to create stuff, which then leads me into the actual creation of this channel. Not even exactly certain as to what inspired me to start a YouTube channel. I had never really done anything on YouTube before other than watch stuff, so I don't know. It was just something to do, I guess. My first few videos were just horrendous, and I don't think I have any of those even on this channel anymore. I've deleted all those. And, you know, from that point, it's been a slow work up to where I am today. For anyone who notices, drama or media creation wasn't involved in any of that discussion, because I have zero experience making videos, and really overall my communication skills are rather bad, and most of what I attribute here is learned behavior, to the point where I would consider being possibly autistic, or at least some sort of neurodivergency. I have tried to get my doctor to look into that, but they're too busy, you know, dealing with the rest of the world and my other issues. So that more or less leads you to where I am today, or at least a little while ago. So I'm going to cut this off here and set up for a part 2. And for anyone still here, thank you very much for listening all this way. I don't really have too much for stories to go on, so if you like this sort of content from me, I don't really have much on this sort of thing, or at least don't have a good understanding of how to take a lot of my experiences and turn them into usable, viewable content. This is just more or less a setup to explain myself, to kind of give everybody a background as to why I'm here and why I'm doing this and why I'm very sporadic and all over the place. So if you did enjoy this, there will be a part 2, which I explain a little bit more about my current situation. And if you didn't enjoy this and you're still here, well, thank you very much for listening, even though you didn't enjoy it. And there'll only be one more of these coming, as far as I know, on this channel, so at least unless something else bad happens, but I don't want to get into that. Anyways, have a good one, guys, and thanks for being there.